Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Outgrow's podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Saksham Sharda. I'm the creative director at outgrow.co. And for this month, we're going to interview Professor Dame Til Wykes, who is a professor of clinical psychology and vice dean of mental health and psychological sciences. Thanks for joining us, Professor.
Great to be here.
So, Professor, we're going to start with a rapid fire round just to break the ice. You get 3 passes. In case you don't want to answer the question, you can just say pass, but try to keep your answers to one word or one sentence only, okay?
So,
All right, so the first one is, how long does it take you to get ready in the mornings?
about 7 minutes.
What time of the day are you most inspired?
Early evening.
Your favorite color?
Blue.
Most embarrassing moment of your life?
Getting the Guinness World Record
Okay.
for the largest mental health lesson.
Oh, wow. And what was it?
It was the Guinness World
Uh-huh.
Record for the largest mental health
Okay.
lesson.
As in, like, how long was it?
Not how long, but how large.
Uh-huh. Okay.
So it was, 400 people or so.
Okay, I see.
Or 400 children. That's a difficult gig if you're doing 400 children.
All right. So the next question is, how many hours of sleep can you survive on?
5.
Favorite book?
The Ragged Trousered Philanthropist.
The city in which the best kiss of your life happened?
Oh, it's tough. There's been so many.
So that's a pass then. Oh.
That's definitely a pass.
The biggest mistake of your career?
Pass.
How do you relax?
Netflix, Prime, books, and occasionally walking.
Your favorite movie about mental health?
Outrageous.
How many cups of coffee do you drink per day?
2.
A habit of yours that you hate?
Pass.
The most valuable skill you've learned in life?
Not to worry about failure.
And the last question is, your favorite online Netflix, Amazon show?
Ted Lasso.
Okay. All right. So that was a rapid fire round. You did quite well, just 2 passes. So now we're going to move on to the bigger questions, and these you can answer with as much ease as you like. And the first one is, can you discuss a specific project or initiative you have been involved in that uses digital technology to improve mental health outcomes?
Okay, well, I've been involved in quite a few,
Mm-hmm.
so it's tough choosing one. But I suppose from the beginning, I helped develop an online treatment, computerized treatment,
Mm-hmm.
blended, so it involves a therapist, to help people with a diagnosis of schizophrenia with their cognitive skills. That's because we know that people's cognitive skills can predict their poorer recovery as they go through life in general. So the idea is to improve their cognitive skills and then get some functional recovery, and particularly to concentrate on their own personal goals. So it's called circuits, and we have evidence now for its effectiveness as well as its efficacy. And we also know now how to implement it because we've just finished a study on different ways of implementing circuits and what is the most cost-effective way.
So, what are some of the ways in which these cognitive skills are being improved?
Okay, well, the software program includes both sort of exercises and tasks. So tasks are a bit like the kind of games that you might play, very neutral. And it's very important to provide neutral tasks because otherwise people get a bit anxious if it's a real life task straight away. And they learn skills like problem solving, breaking down, planning, chunking information, learning how to memorize something. Most times people do have some of those skills, but they've forgotten to use them. Other times they don't actually, because a problem for people with schizophrenia is it starts very early, and so they may never have developed those sorts of skills. And then we provide very similar real life tasks that are kind of built on the same infrastructure as the neutral tasks, and we introduce them to the same things. Use your strategies that you've learned and use your ability to break down a problem. We teach them how to go to work in a factory. We teach them how to make your CV, how to produce a text message from a letter, how you might go about traveling and what you might have to think about in advance, going shopping, making a recipe, and some social tasks as well. And the idea is that we teach them something called metacognition. This is not a game. You don't have to get it correct. You just have to learn the process of being able to carry out a task. That's the point of the program. And we use metacognition in a completely different way by getting people to think about what they're going to do and make choices at the beginning. So guesses, is this going to be a difficult task? How long will it take me? What strategies am I likely to use? And then at the end of these exercises and tasks, they make those same decisions, and they can then reflect on how they may have said it took them 15 minutes at the beginning, but they were overestimating because it actually only took them 3. So the idea is to help people reflect on their behavior, and not just to learn the strategies, but to learn when to use those strategies. But as I said at the beginning, it's a blended therapy. So you can do some of that work on the computer on your own, but a lot of the time, what's helpful is to have a therapist who helps you, points you in the right direction, provides that social support, and provides something that the computer just could not provide, which is noticing when somebody, particularly in the UK, just wants to stop and have a cup of tea, rather than pushing on and making them feel like they're failing because their concentration isn't quite as good.
So what generated your interest in the field of schizophrenia and metacognition in the first place?
I suppose it was a very long time ago. I was developing some measures of social functioning, and I went to a long stay hospital out in the countryside, and I interviewed a lot of people, and I took a lot of measurements. One of those measurements was some cognition measures. And then the hospital closed down. It was a long stay hospital, but then because it was an expert place for rehabilitation, they really tried hard to move people into the most independent living conditions that was possible. And I then went back and found where people were. I did it at 1 year, at 3 years, and at 6 years, and found that the cognition measures actually predicted where they were going. And that was something you couldn't measure. I never told the staff what the cognitive measures were and who was poorer than somebody else. But somehow, even with the best rehabilitation possible, these cognitive problems just were a barrier to taking on the opportunities that were being offered them. So I decided then that, we should be looking at improving cognition, although that was totally against the tide of thought at that time. Everybody thought that the cognitive problems were static, and you just couldn't make any changes. But of course, nobody had actually tried to change them. So it was impossible really to say that they were static. Just that if you did nothing, the cognitive problems were there at age 20, at age 40, and at age 60. But nobody had actually tried to make changes and help people to formulate how they might approach cognitive difficulties. So that's sort of why I was inspired by people and by them telling me they had these cognitive problems. I can't quite concentrate on a conversation. I sometimes, forget what the other person's saying. I can't watch a soap opera on the television because I forget what somebody said earlier in the program. So, or in a newspaper article, I just can't follow it because I forget what's going on at the beginning. So part of all of that was people talking to me about it, but also this research, which showed me that I was, that I'd discovered that people with cognitive difficulties have real problems in the future.
And were digital solutions the first thing you thought of, or did you also think of other solutions first before you came to
I
tech and digital?
definitely was led kicking and screaming to the digital world. Um, so first of all, we used some sort of paper and pencil tasks, still with a therapist. Um, And then we did a study with very young people, and they started to tell us that, what we were doing was boring and why couldn't we do it on a computer? So we then developed the first computerized cognitive remediation program. And it's sort of gone on from there. And it was mainly, again, because, people value the skills of being able to use a computer. So when we started, even the young people hadn't got that many skills because many of them, as I said, a diagnosis of schizophrenia happens early and it develops over a period of time. And often people fell out of school and didn't have the kind of background education or even access to computers and the digital space. So part of providing the computer was also a motivator for people getting involved. But I should say that these are not games. They don't have to be super duper avatars, coming out of the screen at you. We are trying to teach people very specific skills, and we do not need them to be diverted by having effectively Disney animation on the screen. That is not what they need. They need to be considering, how to approach a task and how they might think about using strategies they've learned out in the community in the real world.
Hmm. And in all this, how do you address concerns about access to digital technology solutions, particularly for individuals in underserved communities?
I think it's a real problem. Um, it's not just for underserved communities, even in the less developed world or the less economically, um, the low and middle income countries. It's not even there. It's even in South London, where I'm based. Um, there are communities who, they may have a mobile phone, but it's a pay as you go phone. Or even if they have a smartphone, they've got a very limited data contract. So, and probably do not have any internet at home. Um, we learned over the pandemic how hard it was for many families who had a couple of children who needed to get online to get some education, that actually they only had one piece of equipment to hand around. So I do think if this is a health service intervention, then the health service ought to be thinking about having effectively a lending library of both the data and the ability to use computers. And we have been developing that. We've developed it because if people needed to have online therapy because you couldn't come in to see a therapist, then some services kind of built pods for people so that they could uh, go there and easily log on, with only a couple of keystrokes, and that then they could use a computer wherever they were. And I'm very keen that we teach people not only in a therapist patient dyad, but actually part of this therapy is to teach people to be more independent. So they need to do homework, and on a computer you can tell that they've done their homework because you can see they've logged in. and they need to feel that they own their learning. So part of the whole um, therapy is to provide them with opportunities to be able to practice on their own. So having access to some of these potential lending libraries or to the computer pods is another way of giving them some more independence. So it is a problem. Access to equipment and data is a problem, but so are the technical skills needed, because we assume everybody can use a mouse, and even my 91-year-old dad can email, even if sometimes it's all in capitals. Um, so, so we do have to teach some people how to use the computer, and uh, I think that's fine for us to do. And in fact, our therapy has taken that into account and actually has separate initial phases that you can go through to teach people more about the computer, how to use a mouse, how to access specific things within the program so that they can definitely turn it on and off. And how to enter, so where to put your password and where you might find your password. you know.
Yeah. So access to technology is one thing, basic access to technology. But on the other hand, how do you see far-reaching technology like virtual reality and other immersive technologies being utilized in mental health treatment in the future or now?
Well, there's two ways that it can be used. It can be used to, well, in a very good way, to bring the community into the clinic, because you can provide more situations in VR where people can begin to practice their skills or do the sort of metacognition, self-reflection, which I think is really vital. I know as a clinician, you ask a patient to do some homework in the community. Why don't you just, go to the shops and buy these 4 things? They come back to the next session, they haven't done it. And what you really need is to have a sort of middle step. You can have things on the computer where you're teaching them problem solving and planning, but then I think having them in the clinic actually practicing some of those skills in a more real life situation with VR is a really good way forward as a sort of stepping stone to going out into the community. I think the other thing we can do is to have the clinic in the community. So with VR, you could get people to practice things in their living room as opposed to being in the clinic, and have a more remote system for providing help with the particular problems. I mean, you talked about it as mental health treatment rather than about treatment of cognition, and that can clearly be for depression and thinking automatic thoughts, negative thoughts all the time when you go into situations. Or it could be somebody who feels, paranoia or anxiety when they enter social situations. So you can create social situations and get them to talk about it and talk their way through it in a graded way, which you cannot do in real life. In real life, opportunities are not necessarily provided in a clear graded way where you could go in and come out again. Whereas in virtual reality, you can definitely do that. And so that is a sort of safe way of enabling people to practice skills, which I think is very important.
And is this happening at scale or in some experiments? Is VR being used?
Well, in all of these things, as I discover, you need CE marks and CA marks and registration with various people. Um, so I'm part of a process of providing the um, the understanding of what works. This isn't an app produced on a Monday that's green, and then you produce another one on a Wednesday, which is yellow, and they do the same thing, but they're a different color with no evidence whatsoever. But you can market them somehow as helping with your well being. This is not that kind of space. I think for an ethical mental health digital treatment, you need to show evidence of effects, and also to show if the proportion of people who do not improve. So even if you have a very large effect size, it's called, which is the how much improvement people show, actually there will be some people who will not improve. And people, individuals with mental health problems who then use an app which purports to improve your depression or your well-being, and you don't improve, you will feel even worse about yourself. Whereas we really need to situate that information for people and say, well, for about 2/3 of the people, there was some improvement, but for a third of them, there was no improvement at all. And then all you see is, well, I'm just one of those people who didn't improve on this specific treatment. And I think that's a vital way of making all of these digital treatments transparent, so that you can see even before you press the button to download. I'm very keen on this, that you will see exactly what information this provides. Not only things like, has a test being done on it, but also on who was the test, because a lot of people do these well-being or depression studies on what we might call the worried well, people who are a little low in mood, but they definitely are not depressed. They're just a little low in mood. And what works for people who are a little low in mood may not work at all for people with depression. So I think you need to know what you're getting. I mean, when you go to a supermarket and you look for cornflakes, you can look on the back of the packet before you actually buy it and compare 2 boxes of cornflakes. You can't do that with an app. You have to already have effectively bought it, or even if it was free, given away a lot of your data via the non-privacy statement that you are signing. And I think that is a real setback for digital health interventions. There's been a kind of Wild West,
Yeah.
I think, with this. And that, from a clinician's point of view, I really think we're doing a disservice to people if we don't provide them with evidence that this is likely to work or not work for them, and allow them to know what data is out there, how it's been processed, and not in a 32-page document that you are never going to read. If your personal information is going to a third-party marketer, then people probably need to know that before they click on the button.
And do you think there's going to be a backlash against this Wild West kind of treatment of a very crucial thing like healthcare?
I think health services will become more, what's the word? Well, the problem is it's such a Wild West. There are 75,000 apps produced almost every year that get added to the app stores. And we've no idea what they are, who produced them. They may say things like, this has been produced on cognitive behavioral therapy principles. Most often they're not. They haven't really been tested properly. And I suspect some health services will begin to say, we're not paying for something that we don't know whether it works. And certainly in the National Health Service in the UK, you have to go through lots of hoops to be able to show that something works, so that it can be prescribed in the NHS. Similarly, for the FDA in the States. But most of these people, the cowboys in the Wild West who are producing a lot of these apps, may do it for, good reason, not because they want to make money, because they thought it was a good idea and they got the coding skills. Those people are probably going to have a harder time in the future actually making a living out of producing these sorts of so-called help for mental health problems.
And so, what do you think are, well, in a different topic, what do you think are the steps being taken to integrate these digital technology solutions with traditional forms of therapy and treatment? What's the future of that?
I think there's a big future in that. There's a future on either side. Most patients, people with mental health problems, when you ask them, will you have just uh, an eHealth intervention? They will say, no, we don't want it instead of seeing a person, but we will still use it if it's as well as seeing a person. So I think there are uh, services in the UK which stage the intervention. So you get a kind of online help first, and then you get more support, and then you get face to face treatment. I don't know that that's quite right, but I do think it's important that we do that they're complementary. They're not either or. And the reason I stress the sort of service mental health service user point of view is that I'm very keen that we should take their views into account rather than just clinicians, or even those sort of service providers who think, oh, we'll have that, e-health system because it would be cheaper. It's not necessarily cheaper. Um, and for clinicians, one of the things that they don't want is to feel they're losing their skills. And they certainly will lose valuable clinical skills for a health service if they don't actually see enough patients of a similar kind. So I see these as, I've sort of described circuits at the beginning as a blended therapy. It's a therapy where we help to introduce the person to the program. We stick with them to point out the things that they need to know, because those things are not necessarily obvious in the computer program. And you don't necessarily want to, hit them over the head with big words on the screen saying, now you have metacognition. It's more subtle than that. They're acting as a teacher and a therapist and a supporter. And we know that social reinforcement is much the best way of helping people to absorb information. So they're there to do all those three things, and and to step away and allow the person to become more independent as you go through therapy. And I think that's the best way to go with these therapies, that it will be blended, not definitely not an either or.
Hmm. And could you talk a bit more about the supporter aspect of this? Because the teacher and therapist, I guess we have discussed a lot, but the supporter aspect?
I think, um, well, the difficulty is the therapist and supporter kind of overlap they all overlap
Yeah.
quite a lot. So part of the support is that, if a person is faced with a new problem that looks too complicated, they kind of shut down and think, I don't want to do that. So part of the supporter role is to help them through that process in order that they should actually have a go. Because we know that people who do well in exams are the people who spend time thinking about the problem, not moving on fast and finishing quickly. It's when they spend time thinking about the problem and they become much more successful. So part of the supporter role is to do that work. And it's very hard for a computer to do that work. I think, computers could step in as teachers, and no, I don't doubt that they could step in as a therapist, although, there's a lot of chatbots around that would think they could. Um, I think that you need that kind of support. I don't know whether you've come across it before, but you're faced with a really complicated statistical analysis and you think, I'm never, ever going to be able to do this. And what you really need is somebody to open the gate and let you think about it a bit more and do it in sort of small doses of introductions to this, and suddenly become much more familiar, and you're not going to immediately, that sort of gate comes down in front of you, you say, I definitely can't do this.
Hmm. Yeah. So I was going to say, how do you think, like, as far as ethics goes, so you've already spoken about the wild west of like there being no ethics in the app marketplace. But even for apps that aim to be ethical, what is the future of that? Like, what are the ethical considerations or challenges associated with the use of such digital technology?
Well, mainly, I think, where the data goes.
Mm,
I think that's a big issue, even for um, organizations that have, evidence of efficacy. I think the problem is uh, how you're going to turn a profit to keep it going. And I've heard people at uh, conferences like Web Summit
mm.
say, well, we're going to have to sell off the data because there's no way that we can actually manage to keep going without that. Um, so I do think that the business plan has to be rethought. And, people keep telling me, you know, we can't go back on providing things for free. There is no such thing as a free um, service. Something has to be paid for. So I do think that health providers need to think how this digital health system will actually help improve their patients so that the patients don't come back again into the service and cost money, and which can help them to kind of move forward and recover. The problem is the costs, as I've managed to do recently, looking at cost effectiveness, is that you shift the costs. So a health service could be buying the app, but the savings are maybe made within the health system, but they're moved on to community costs for support within the community. And so it's quite difficult to trace how effective it can be, and therefore how much it's worth paying for that as a society. And I think the financial model is a big driver of the ethical issues that we need to sort out. I mean, one of the obvious ethical issues, though, is the sort of UX design. It's, what you really need is to have service users there at the beginning, not at the end looking at feasibility, but actually saying, this is the sort of problem you need to solve, not the problem that you thought you were solving when you woke up this morning, just because you knew how to code it to produce that app or health measure. And I do think the ethics are a lot to do with transparency, trust in what you're doing. I had 4 T's, but I can't remember the other two. T for I call them T for T principles. So it's sort of trust for transparency kinds of issues, which we really need to have um, in this field because it has kind of run away with us.
All right. So, as a person at the forefront of the field we're talking about in general, what is your prediction for the next 10 years, the next decade, but then the next 50 years, and then the next 100 years? Where is this headed in general? Uh, Schizophrenia, all of this, yeah.
Okay, I think the well, let's talk about the infrastructure
Hmm.
first because that is a big barrier. I think the infrastructure is just going to be built, you know, and I also think that we learn. I said that there were these issues about equipment in low and middle income countries. Actually, we should be learning from low and middle income countries. What's the lifetime of a phone in those countries as opposed to in the UK and in Europe? Um, so I do think there will be more access to an internet rather than the internet. That some people may begin to pay for services which they would have got for free today because of the issues about security and privacy of data. but also about the Wild West as well, which is like the Mastodon and Twitter issues at the moment. Who knows what will happen to Mastodon, but it's clear that Twitter is losing followers and its market share because of the way that it's managing data. And if companies begin to build up that trust, there's financial incentives to do that. I then think that because of that, because the infrastructure will change, I think it will become much easier. It will be thought of as a community resource, just like water is, and that we may be paying somewhere in our taxes for that service, but that will allow much more of these. I think blended therapies are where health services are going to go. I think there'll be more remote provision of therapies. I think we learned that during COVID, the sort of telehealth type approaches, which of course they've been doing in Australia for a very long time because people are so remote. And I think there will be more services that are developed, but I suspect fewer companies will be making them. I think there is not a sustainability, I don't think, of the market as it is. So, no matter how enthusiastic you are, you probably need to start with more money than you think. It's unlikely it's going to be in a garage somewhere in Palo Alto. So, I think that's for the next 10 to 50 years. I think between 10 and 50 years, we'll have better sort of visual, virtual reality. So I think we'll get better avatars. We already have something called avatar therapy, actually, at the institute where I work, where you build an avatar that looks like the voice you hear in your head. And then the therapist, again, blended therapy, the therapist actually speaks through the avatar. And it's a very uncomfortable feeling because the avatars sometimes say terrible things, but you then react to the person's voice when because often the voices will go away if the person actually takes control. And it may be we do that now, but it may be that we can begin to automate some of the process of speaking to a person. That would take the load certainly off the therapist, even if the therapist has to guide some of this. And I think we'll have more blended therapies. This is up to 50 years. I don't know. I think 15 years ago, if I had had to imagine the future now, 15 years ago, I would have had terrible trouble, trying to think, even though I knew people who were writing the internet, writing the code, I don't think I would have realized how big an issue it would become. And if you go back even longer than that, 25 years ago, lots of things really changed. And, maybe we will have, for health, little implants for people measuring people's blood pressure continually, like they do for people with diabetes, where it measures your blood sugar. Maybe we'll have other, bits and bobs rather than tattoos. We'll just have these things stuck to the outside or on the inside of us, measuring something which is important. And that's quite likely to be the case in the future. And there will be other breakthroughs. There will be other breakthroughs in learning more about why we get some of these problems, like, developing schizophrenia. And we might be able to prevent some of them. But I don't know and that may be helped by having a kind of observational individual data, which is collected via a Fitbit or by your smartphone, in terms of speaking on the phone and recording your speech and learning something about you from your speech tones or where you're walking. I mean, I do that now, actually. Oh, I'm really sorry. That was.
That's all
Okay, so those are the sorts of things that I think might happen. And, we're looking at ways to predict relapse in the future from active and passive means. So by, speech, by GPS signals, by just passive accelerometers in your either in your phone or in your watch to try and predict relapse in depression and schizophrenia. I think we might have cracked that by year 50, and that might help us then in the next 50 years to prevent some of these difficulties arising. We will never be able to prevent life events. Life goes on, stuff happens, and the stuff that happens will have an effect on us. So traumatic events will always have an effect on us. So we won't be able to prevent everything, but maybe we'll be able to predict a few things.
So leaving all that behind or in front, because it's the future, the last question is a bit of a personal kind. It is for you. The question is, what would you be doing in your life if not this?
I think when I was little, I did an awful lot of reading in our village library. I ran out of the children's section, so they allowed me to go to the non-fiction section of the library. And, if I'd been taller, I could have been an architect or an accountant or a ballet dancer because they were on the top shelf. In the end, I became a psychologist because I could reach the shelf with the books on with psychology age 11. So I think I was always interested in people, but I'm also interested in maths and, design. And I used to do ballet. So who knows what I would have done. I don't think I ever made a decision to be a psychologist. I just ended up here, where I am now. So without very much of a decision-making process, I must admit, which is not the way that I mentor other people to have a more strategic view of their career.
That's interesting. So in another universe, I'm interviewing you as a ballerina. But in this one, this is great. Yeah. All right. So that was the last question. Thanks everyone for joining us for this month's episode of Outgrowth Podcast. That was Dame Til Wykes. Thanks for joining us, Professor.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Check out her website for more details, and we'll see you once again next month with another episode.